Chapter 721. Xyla staggered for a while, lowered her head, and said apathetically, "Thank you." Maisie walked up to the bed. "I have already caught one of them." "I didn't expect that Maisie would be so evil. She actually sent someone to you to destroy your chastity." Xyla was stunned. Jason chimed in and asked, "What do you mean, miss? Are you saying Mrs. Goldman sent those people to violate Ms. Mayweather?" Maisie had not expected that she would be so lucky to run into them and escape the disaster. Therefore, she had decided to play along, saved her, and pushed all the blame to Maisie. "If you don't believe me, I can bring that guy over here. You can ask him whatever you want," Maisie said as she looked at Xyla's expression. After a short while, she continued. "I believe I've warned you about Maisie, Ms. Mayweather. She's cunning and evil. She will never let go of anyone who has pissed her off." Xyla fell silent. The next day, Maisie went to the Lucas family's villa. She handed the evidence Nolan had given her to Louis. Louis looked through Naomi's medical history sheet and frowned slightly. "Where did you get this from?" Maisie chuckled and replied, "Of course, it's Nolan who gave it to me. Consider this a chance for you to get Riley to thank you." Louis looked at the material and chuckled. When Louis came out of the villa with Maisie, a man wearing a mask came up to them and pulled out a glass bottle in his hand, wanting to throw some kind of liquid at Maisie. "Watch out!" Louis shouted as he pulled Maisie out of the way. Sadie hurriedly threw the jacket over to the bottle and kicked the man to the ground. However, her hand was burned by the liquid. "Sadie." Maisie's expression changed. She went up to her and checked her hand. There were several blisters on her palm. "This is..." Maisie's gaze fell on the jacket on the ground. It was melting away, and her face turned pale. It was sulfuric acid. Louis went forward and pinned the man on the ground. He pulled the mask off the man's face, and all of them were stunned. Maisie was familiar with the man. He was Xyla's assistant, Jason. Jason did not show any remorse for what he did even though he was caught. He looked at Maisie straight and shouted, "Yes, it's me. A woman like you should just rot in hell. It was my mistake that I failed to destroy that disgusting face of yours." Louis's face sank, and he asked, "Did Xyla send you here?" "This has nothing to do with Ms. Mayweather. I decided to do it myself," Jason said through gritted teeth as he stared viciously at Maisie. "You know very well what you did to Ms. Mayweather." Louis turned his head to look at Maisie. Maisie squinted her eyes, and her face was cold. "What did I do to her?" Jason sneered and replied. "You don't dare to admit it, do you?" Maisie did not know why Jason hated and despised her so much. She thought she was already good enough that she had ignored all those tricks that Xyla had played behind her, but now it was as if she was the one doing something to Xyla. Jason had even tried to pour strong sulfuric acid on her. If Sadie hadn't reacted in time, her face would have been destroyed. Her face sank, and she said expressionlessly, "Let's go to the police station and tell everything to the cops." Jason scoffed. "Sure. Let's go. Do you think I'm afraid of you? I'll tell everyone everything you have done." In the police station, Jason was detained for throwing acid on Maisie. He admitted his doing, but he wanted Maisie to admit everything she had done to Xyla as well. A police officer approached Maisie and said, "Ms. Vanderbilt, he said that you hired someone to violate Ms. Mayweather. Can you come with me? I have a few questions for you." Chapter 722. Maisie was stunned for a while, before she nodded. She followed the police officer into the interrogation room. She answered all of the questions from the police officers honestly. Since police officers felt that she was not lying based on her expression and there was no way Jason could justify his claims, she was released. As soon as she came out of the police station, she saw Nolan's car outside and figured that it must be Sadie who had informed him. Nolan got out of the car. He was wearing a black three-piece suit that made him look upright and serious. The wind had tousled his hair. There were harsh lines running down either side of his face, and his gaze was cold. When Maisie stopped in front of him, he grabbed her so tightly into his arms that veins were bulging out of the back of his hand. He kissed the top of her head deeply without saying anything. Maisie buried her face in his chest and said, "I'm sorry, Nolan." His heart was pumping fast. And it was only then Maisie realized how worried and scared he was. He pressed his lips tightly on her forehead and said in a hoarse voice, "Thank goodness that you're all right." Maisie lifted her head to look at him. "Can you not do anything before I figure everything out?" Nolan's gaze was deep as he replied flatly, "Okay. Everything you said." Lewis came to look for Xyla. Due to what had happened to her last night, Xyla had been staying in her apartment. She had not moved out of her apartment even after coming back from overseas. Therefore, she was overjoyed when Lewis came to find her. "You still remember that I live here?" Lewis stood in front of the door with no intention of going in at all. "Do you know that your assistant is being detained in the police's Tadaion now?" Xyla was dumbfounded. "What? Jason is being detained in the police station?" Lewis turned around and walked to the window beside the corridor. He looked at the view of the neighborhood and continued. "He is arrested because he tried to harm Maisie with a strong sulfuric acid. As for what will happen to him, it depends on Mr. Goldman." Xyla froze. It appeared to Lewis that she did not know what Jason had done. "How is that possible? Is Ms. Vanderbilt all right now?" "She's fine. Jason didn't manage to do it," Lewis said as he turned around and looked at her. "I just wanted to come and make sure of it. I didn't ask Jason to do that." Xyla could see that Lewis was still suspicious of her. She explained, "I didn't expect Jason would do something like that." Lewis nodded. He turned his head around and looked outside of the window again without saying anything. Xyla's shoulders trembled, and her eyes turned red around the rim. "You don't trust me? Do you think I was the one who sent Jason to do that to her?" His refusal to respond irritated Xyla. "I'm not stupid enough to harm her, but why did she try to harm me?" It was only then Lewis turned around and looked at her. "She's trying to harm you?" Xyla sneered and said, "I was nearly raped by someone last night, and that person told me that it was Maisie who sent him to me. Yes, it's true that I have my own motive for signing the endorsement contract with Soul. I know she's wary of me, but I've never really done anything to her. So why must she do that to me?" Lewis frowned slightly and said after a short while, "Maisie isn't that kind of person." "Oh yeah? Why do you trust her so much?" Xyla said as tears began to roll down her face, "Your fiancé is Riley, and she's just her friend." "You'd rather believe in her friend than me?" Lewis turned around and looked at her. "It's because she's my cousin. She is my mother's niece, and I know better than you what kind of person she is." Xyla was taken aback. "Maisie is Lewis's cousin." Before Lewis left, he said, "Even if she wanted to do something to you, she wouldn't resort to such a nasty approach. I suggest you look into it yourself and see if you're someone's cat's paw." Chapter 723. Lewis left without turning his head. The tears on Xyla's face were slowly drying up. She took a step back and leaned on the wall as she slowly calmed herself down. At Black Gold, Quincy pushed the door open and walked into the office. He handed a document to Nolan and said, "I've checked the surveillance cameras around the bar Ms. Mayweather went last night. It's true that a few thugs nearly raped her." Nolan scanned through the document and put it aside. "Go find them." Quincy nodded. After Quincy left the office, Nolan leaned against the back of the chair and rubbed his forehead. His heart had nearly leaped out of his throat when he heard from Sadai that someone had nearly poured sulfuric acid on Maisie. No matter who wanted to harm her this time, he was not going to let them go away. Soon, Quincy found the group of men through the surveillance video. Sadai tagged along with him and came to a billiard parlor, where they usually gathered for gambling. Both of them barged into the billiard parlor, and there were a lot of unemployed young men in there. When they sensed that they had come with bad intentions, they all picked up their weapons and asked, "Who the hell are you guys?" Before Quincy could say anything, Sadai had already charged toward them. Her strikes were lethal, and she was agile. She slalomed between 10 or so strong young men, taking them down one by one in several quick moves. In the end, all of them had collapsed to the ground, moaning and squirming in pain. 2 more men were hiding in the corner. They were so scared they did not dare to make any sound. Quincy took out Xyla's photo and showed it to them. "Have you seen this woman before?" The man, whose bone Sadai had broken, nodded and said, "Yes. We saw her yesterday." Quincy pressed on. "Who sent you to her?" The man's eyes swiveled around in his sockets. He swallowed a few gulps of saliva, but he did not say anything. Sadai pulled out a gun, and the man's expression changed drastically. "It's Ms. Hannigan." It went without saying that Quincy knew which Ms. Hannigan he was talking about. They then left the billiard parlor after getting the answer. When they arrived in front of their car, Quincy turned around and realized that Sadai was playing with the gun in her hand. His expression changed, and he said, "It's already surprising enough that you're bringing a gun with you. But how could you play with it? Do you want it to go off?" "I'm still young, and I don't want to die so early." Sadai glanced at him and pulled the trigger. A plume of blue flame then sprouted from the muzzle, and Quincy was rendered speechless. "So it's just a lighter." Quincy reported his findings to Nolan, and when Nolan heard that Maisie was behind everything, his face sank. He tapped his finger on the desk and said, "Go ask Nathaniel. Does he want his daughter or his family?" As soon as Maisie stepped into her house, she heard her mother crying. "I'm sure it isn't Z. It must be someone who instructed her to do that." Nathaniel couldn't stand her crying anymore. He smashed the teapot on the floor and said, "You're still protecting her after all this time? I fed and clothed you and your daughter. But look at what your daughter has done. She brought nothing but troubles and problems to her family." Maisie was stunned. She stood frozen stiff in the foyer and didn't enter the living room. Mrs. Hannigan saw her and called out to her. "Z. Humph. Since you are back, hurry up. Pack your things and get out." Nathaniel said without looking at her. "What do you mean, Dad?" Maisie walked up to Nathaniel and asked, "How can you chase me away? Who gave you the permission to do that?" Nathaniel gave her a huge slap in the cheek, sending Maisie falling to the floor. Her face filled with shock and fear. Nathaniel pointed at her and said, "You know clearly what you have done. From today onward, you're not my daughter. Get out of my house. Please, Nathaniel. Z has grown up beside me since she was a kid. Where do you want her to go?" Mrs. Hannigan kneeled on the floor and pleaded, hoping that Nathaniel would change his mind, but to no avail. He pushed her away mercilessly. Chapter 724. She brought that to herself. "I can't help her. I can't let the Hannigans get destroyed in her hands," Nathaniel said expressionlessly. He then went upstairs without looking at both of them. Maisie's body trembled. Had what she had done been discovered? That was the thought that surfaced in her head. All of the socialites in Bassburg were discussing the matter of Maisie getting chased out of the Hannigans, and the news soon reached Maisie's ears. She already knew from Sadai that it was Maisie who had hired someone to rape Xyla and push the blame to her. By the time she learned about it, she did not know whether she should laugh or get angry. Perhaps this is what they used to say, when you don't look for trouble, trouble will find its way to you. A female employee appeared outside and knocked on the door. "Ms. Vanderbilt, Ms. Mayweather is here to see you." Maisie froze, and her eyes blinked. "Let her in." Xyla walked into the office. Gone was the arrogant and confident girl. "I came to apologize to you on behalf of Jason. Jason is my assistant and has been training abroad with me for many years. It was only because of Maisie that he would do something so rashly to you. Since she had come to apologize and she was fine, Maisie decided to forgive her. Please take care of your assistant in the future, Ms. Mayweather. I'm easygoing, but Nolan is not. Xyla made a bow and said, thank you. Maisie did not say anything anymore as she watched her leave her office. She had heard that Jason was detained for 15 days. Even if he got released, Xyla's company wouldn't let him stay with her anymore, and Maisie felt this should be a good lesson for both of them. In the afternoon, Maisie visited Black Gold with the meal box that she made. The staff at the front desk told her that Nolan was having a meeting right now. So she went to wait for him in the office. Maisie sat in the leather chair behind the desk. She turned around and looked at the view through the ceiling-to-floor window. She kicked the floor, and the chair kept turning. She played with the chair for a long while until a hand appeared and fell on the back of the chair. He turned her over to face him and said, seems like you're having a lot of fun. Nolan placed both his hands on the armrest of the chair. He leaned forward and trapped Maisie within his arms. There seemed to have been such a scene deep in his memory. Inside his memory, he had trapped her in his arms, and she was sitting in front of him. There was a smile in Maisie's eyes as she said, well, it's not as fun as when I'm playing with you. Nolan gave her forehead a light flick as he said helplessly, stop messing with me. I'm worried that I won't be able to hold myself back. Maisie looked at the meal box on the table and said, the snacks I made for you got cold since your meeting took so long. It's okay. Nolan walked over to the table and opened up the meal box. There were some cookies and cakes inside. I'll eat whatever you made for me. Maisie stood up and led him to his chair. She made him sit down and said, then you'll need to give it a good try. Nolan chuckled and popped one of the cookies into his mouth. She went closer to him and asked, is it good? It's good, Nolan replied. It feels like I've not been eating anything made by you for a long time. Maisie was stunned. It was true that she rarely went to the kitchen after returning to Bassburg. When she had been making cookies and cake today, she felt that her baking skills had gotten a little rusty. Mr. Goldman. Quincy entered the office and felt a little embarrassed when he saw Maisie was also in the office. But this isn't my fault. It was them who didn't close the door. An awkward expression appeared on Nolan's face. Upon his return from the meeting, the receptionist had told him that Maisie was here. As such, his mind had been so occupied with the thought of coming to see her that he had forgotten to close the door. He placed the meal box down and asked, what's happening? Quincy went forward and said hesitantly, it's about Colton. Both Nolan and Maisie were stunned. However, Maisie came back to her senses first and asked anxiously, what happened to Colton? Chapter 725. Quincy hemmed and hawed for a while before squeezing the words out of his lips. Well, nothing happened to him. It was his teacher. He beat up his teacher. Maisie took a deep breath and turned her head around to look at Nolan. Did you hear that? That's your son. What are you going to do about it? Nolan cleared his throat and nodded. Yes, it's my fault. I'll punish him later when we get home. By the time Maisie and Nolan got to the school, Colton and Daisy were being scolded and criticized in the school office. Colton was not injured. Instead, they heard that the middle-aged teacher who had taken a beating had a bruise on his face, and there was a bite mark on the back of his hand. When Daisy saw Maisie, she rushed up to her and said with her mouth pouted, Mommy. She hugged Daisy in her arms and asked worriedly, can you tell me what happened to you and Colton? She was very certain that Colton and Daisy wouldn't simply hit their teacher. There must be a reason or a misunderstanding. When the school principal saw Nolan, he got up from his chair. Mr. Goldman. What brought you here today? Nolan glanced at Colton and said, I heard that my son beat up his school teacher. Don't worry. We're now investigating the matter. The school principal bowed at Nolan as he wiped the cold sweat off his head. He knew that these two kids were Nolan's children. If not, he would have expelled both of them according to what he would do in the past. It was just that there was nothing he could do since they refused to apologize to the teacher. Nolan approached Colton and looked down at him. "Can you tell me the reason you hit your teacher?" Colton raised his head high and straightened his body to look back at Nolan and said, "He bullied my sister, so I hit him back." "Bully?" Maisie was stunned when she heard what Colton said, and a bad feeling rose from her stomach pit. The school principal offered them a helpless smile and said, "Mr. Warner is a teacher, and there's no way he would bully his student. He told us that it was just a misunderstanding." Colton crossed his arms in front of his chest and turned his face sideways. He called Daisy to his office alone. He said he was going to give her an extra lesson on her homework, but he was touching her everywhere. "I saw it all with my own eyes." The school principal's expression changed. It would harm the school's reputation if something like that went out. He looked toward Nolan carefully. Just as he expected, Nolan's face was dark. He then ordered in a stern voice, "Go get Mr. Warner. How dare that old bastard does that kind of thing to my daughter? Does he have a death wish?" The school principal had no other choice but to do Nolan's bidding. After all, if Nolan was not happy with the way he handled the matter, there was a huge probability that he would strip him of his title of being the school principal. Besides, Daisy was once a child star and had starred in a few TV shows with Helios. Even though she had withdrawn herself from the entertainment industry to focus on her education and wouldn't be playing in any TV shows until she was 18, she still had a lot of fans. Once the matter got out, it would be a disaster for the school. Therefore, he sent someone to get Hunter to the office. Hunter was attending to his wound in the infirmary when they went to look for him. While they were on their way back to the school office, he chided Daisy inwardly for biting him so hard and swore that he would teach both of the kids a lesson. When he stepped into the office, Maisie recognized him at first glance. Nolan noticed the changes in her expression and turned to look at Hunter coldly. Hunter was the school principal's relative. Therefore, he was confident that nothing would happen to him. Even if the kids called their parents, he could handle them and settle the matter out of court as well. After all, in his opinion, they were just kids. And there was nothing they could do to him. However, he was stunned by Nolan's imposing aura. Judging from his attire and the vibe he sensed from him, it seemed to him that the man before him was from an elite family. Then, when he met Maisie's gloomy gaze, his expression abruptly changed. And he hurriedly averted his eyes. Chapter 726. Nolan looked expressionless, but the emotional turbulence surging at the bottom of his eyes looked stern and borderline murderous. "Did you lay your fingers on my daughter?" "I didn't. This is all just a misunderstanding, sir. I only wanted to give Daisy some extra lessons. It's just that this girl was a little extreme." Hunter tried to defend himself. Nolan's eyes looked gloomy, and he kept on staring at Hunter without uttering a single word, but it was enough to send chills down Hunter's spine. Colton scoffed coldly. "You were clearly bullying Daisy." Hunter calmed himself down deep down. "Colton, what you're saying is slandering me, your teacher." After Hunter tried his best to defend himself and rectify his actions, Maisie, who had been silent, chuckled casually. "I don't think this is a misunderstanding." Hunter tried his best to cover himself. "Madam, you must be able to put forward some evidence when you say something like that." "It's not that I don't have any evidence. Didn't I meet you in the back garden the other day during the parents-teachers meeting?" Maisie deliberately mentioned the incident that had taken place in the back garden, and it made Hunter look extremely embarrassed as he had been wishing she would not recognize him. She was merciless. That child said everything out loud that day. "You're a teacher of this school, and I don't have to remind you what you did that day, do I?" The principal stared at Hunter. "What the hell did you do? I'm being wrongfully accused." Nolan ignored all the arguments, walked up to the couch, unbuttoned his suit, and sat down. My daughter has been wronged in this school, and I'm not going to let this slide. Not anyone can lay any of their fingers on my daughter. The principal walked up to Nolan with cold sweat beads rolling down his forehead and bowed. Don't worry, Mr. Goldman. I'll definitely get to the bottom of this incident. Nolan lifted his eyelids and raised his gaze slightly. Can I trust you with that? The principal was stunned for a split second and vowed. Yes, Mr. Goldman. Please leave this to me. The worst outcome would be Hunter being suspended and sent back home for a certain period to keep him out of the limelight for a while. I'll do anything as long as these scandals can be suppressed. Nolan's gaze, scrutinizing him from head to toe, became more intense and terrifying. The principal almost failed to keep himself together, and that was when Joe appeared outside the door. He nodded to Maisie first and then claimed to the principal, I can testify for the children. The principal was taken aback. Joe. You. When Joe walked up to the principal and said something in his ear, the principal's expression became even more bewildered. Hunter glared at Joe. What do you mean by that? What have I done to offend you that you're doing this to me? Joe turned to look at him. You'll be surprised by the number of people that you've offended in the past, Mr. Warner. Hunter was at a loss for words. He then glanced at the gloomy principal and exclaimed anxiously, Sir, you have to believe me. The principal glared at Joe, and the latter reminded him with a smile. The school won't be responsible for this incident. I think you must understand that. The principal pointed at Hunter. You son of a bitch. How dare you commit such a shameless act that would put the school's reputation at risk? The board will deal with this, however they deem appropriate. You're on your own this time around. I don't care anymore. Hunter was dumbfounded, and he began to panic. Sir. Uncle. I'm your eldest nephew. You can't just leave me here. But no matter how Hunter tried to defend himself and claimed that he had been framed, the principal ignored him. Maisie took a glance at Joe and wondered what he had told the principal that made him give up his plan to interfere in Hunter's affairs completely. I could actually see just now that the principal only wanted to cover this matter up for Hunter. After all, it's impossible for him not to have heard a thing about what Hunter's been doing in the school all this while. The only possible explanation is that he's been turning a blind eye to Hunter's actions. Hunter is his nephew, but he didn't dare to fool around with Nolan just now. However, everyone in Bassburg knows that Nolan has lost his memory. So I think he was certain Nolan wouldn't be able to keep a close eye on the school at all times. Chapter 727. He might have promised that he would investigate the incident meticulously, but if Joe hadn't come over just now, I'm afraid that he would definitely come up with something to cover up the incident again. Nolan had seen through all of this long ago. But he stood up since the principal had already made him a promise. Then I'll wait for the school to provide me with a satisfactory answer later on. The principal bowed and nodded in his drenched shirt. Don't worry, Mr. Goldman. I'll be on it right after this. Nolan stayed behind to deal with this matter while Maisie took the children away from the principal's office first. Colton kept on complaining about the teacher from the beginning to the end. So Maisie lifted her hand to rub his head. Mommy is very happy that you were able to protect your sister, but hitting your teacher is really not the right thing to do. Having said that, she leaned over, stared at him, and flicked her fingers against his forehead. And not only did you hit him, but you also spread the incident around the school. And now the whole school knows about the incident. Colton rubbed his forehead. Just let it be. It doesn't matter, because that old scumbag will get exposed sooner or later. I think I've let him off easy just by kicking his butt. If it weren't for my concern for Daisy that I chose to follow the both of them secretly, Daisy would have been scared to death. Maisie frowned, turned her head to look at Daisy, who had been quiet and keeping her head down all this while. Her heart sank to the bottom of her chest cavity. After what happened back there, she would definitely be haunted by this nightmare for some time. So I guess I can't blame everything on Colton. I think I would have broken his arm if I were there. Maisie seemed to have thought of something and asked Colton. You once told me that that pretty-looking boy is one of your classmates, isn't he? Daisy looked up at her. She then blinked her clear and bright eyes as if she was curious. Are you referring to Nolace? He's a new student who transferred into our class last semester. He's the one who snatched the first place in class from Colton. Colton clicked his tongue in annoyance at the statement that pierced through his heart. That boy looks just like a sissy. Would he have been able to take the first place from me if I hadn't let him off deliberately? Daisy regained her vitality and energy in an instant. The incident did not seem to have caused any major psychological trauma to her. She stood with arms akimbo. You can continue to act all narcissistic, Colton. It's so obvious that he's much cleverer than you are. Maisie covered her forehead with her palm as soon as the two rugrats started arguing again. Nolan returned to the car after resolving everything in the principal's office. Maisie was already sitting in the car waiting for him. She turned around and asked as soon as he got into the car, has everything been handled properly? He nodded and lowered the car window halfway. Your friend helped out a lot. Are you guys close to each other? Maisie was dumbfounded and rendered speechless for a split second. She then burst into laughter. Why ask? Are you jealous? Nolan squinted slightly. She rested her chin on his shoulder. Joe, Riley, and I were classmates back in high school. The three of us used to be besties. Nolan pinched her chin lightly. How close were you two? Maisie wrapped her arms around him. We were once close enough to share the same pair of shorts. He looked at her again, frowned, and withdrew his hand after a short while. It's fine to have female besties, but not men. She laughed and said, I should put more emphasis on the word once. Nolan held her in his arms and smiled helplessly. Why didn't I get to know you earlier? Maisie raised his eyebrows. Would you want to be my male bestie with whom I would share the same pair of shorts? He kissed her on her temple. Nah, I only want to be someone that can get you into bed. The next day, the school made a statement that they would let off Hunter, and the board would never hire Hunter again. The statement also brought up Hunter's faulty behavior and criticized him for not being a role model for his students. It was said that Joe had forced the principal to compromise and abandon his nephew because Joe threatened him with the board of directors. The board of directors had recommended Joe to the school. Although he was only an English teacher, he still had a degree in forensic science and medicine. Not to mention that he had connections with some of the higher UPS. That was why the principal had to give up on the idea of keeping his nephew in the school. Chapter 728. Riley was a little surprised when she heard that Joe had stopped practicing medicine and had become an English teacher. He actually changed his career path? Maisie fidgeted the pen in her hand. I only found out about it recently. Riley leaned on the back of the couch. It's been a long time since I last contacted Joe. Why don't we fix a date and time for the three of us to get together someday? Maisie looked at her. Then we'll still have to resolve your issue first. Didn't you mention that Lewis has found new evidence? Speaking of this, Riley picked up the pillow and hugged it in her arms. Yeah, he's found something. Maisie propped her hand against her chin and let off a faint smile. Then you have to show him your appreciation. He's out there running around and investigating the little things just for you, so to be honest, I won't believe anyone that says that he doesn't have feelings for you. Riley's expression looked weird. Does he have feelings for me? Is that a joke? Why would Lewis take a fancy to me? He's at most helping me out as my fiancé. Maisie smiled and said nothing. Riley has never had a boyfriend, so she's indeed a slow one when it comes to romantic relationships. Otherwise, she and Joe would have ended up together long ago. Joe had a thing for her back in high school. And even I, an outsider, was aware of his feelings for her. However, Riley had always regarded him as her male bestie and didn't realize any of that. Riley stared at her cell phone screen and saw something pop up. Holy shit! The group has released a huge bombshell. And what's that? The daughter of the Hannigans has completely ended all possibilities that she would have continued to enjoy here in Bassburg this time around. She's been completely banned in the whole of Bassburg and most probably won't be able to continue to stay in the city. Sure enough, things won't end well for any woman who's gotten their eyes fixed on your husband. The corners of Maisie's lips twitched slightly. The statement sounds about right. We had run into Willow and Rowena before this, and now we've found ourselves dealing with Maisie, another young lady who's too full of herself. And indeed, nothing has ever ended well for any of them. The fact that Maisie is banned has always been within my expectations. She's gotten to where she is today only because of her own doing. She's a very ambitious woman, but she doesn't have the brain to back up her balls. Even though she didn't do anything to Nolan. She tried to drag Xyla down from where she is by trying to ruin her reputation. It's only natural for Xyla to retaliate against her. Maisie went to the hospital to visit Kennedy later that afternoon. She was pushing the door open to get into the ward when she saw Samantha in the room in addition to Kennedy. Samantha sat in the chair next to the bed, and the conversation between the two came to an abrupt end when Maisie appeared at the door all of a sudden. Kennedy was stunned for a split second and then welcomed her with a smile. Z, why are you here? Maisie walked up to the bedside. I happen to be free. I was worried that you'd be bored in the hospital, so I came to spend some time with you. But I really didn't expect to see Auntie Samantha here. Even though Samantha had left the Bouchers, she was still as elegant and gentle as she used to be. She stood up slowly and explained, Mr. Fannon's injury is almost fully healed, and he'll be discharged from the hospital tomorrow. So I came to visit him for one last time today. Maisie looked at Kennedy and gave off a pregnant smirk. Uncle Kennedy, Auntie Samantha is your life savior. So it shouldn't be a problem for you to invite her out for a meal after you get discharged from the hospital, right? Kennedy nodded, agreeing with Maisie's statement, while Samantha let off a helpless chuckle. You don't have to go through all that trouble just to treat me to a meal, do you? Maisie looked at her. How is it troublesome? If it weren't for you, Uncle Kennedy might not have escaped the catastrophe from that night with only a flesh wound. Besides, Uncle Kennedy did just mention that he needs an opportunity to show you his appreciation. After saying that, Maisie smiled at Kennedy. Am I right, Uncle Kennedy? Kennedy could see that Maisie had an ulterior motive when she was hinting at him to ask Samantha out for a meal, but he did not refuse to do so as Samantha was his savior. Chapter 729. It was a rainy day the next day. The cold autumn breeze blew against the car's windows as the raindrops rolled down the foggy windows, blurring the scene outside of the car. The car was parked outside the hospital entrance. And Maisie got out of the car with an umbrella and opened it up. Uncle Kennedy. Sorry to have to trouble you to come to pick me up even on a rainy day. Kennedy took the umbrella in Maisie's hand. This is no big deal. Maisie looked down at her watch. I've already reserved a private room in a restaurant in advance on your behalf, and Auntie Samantha should have arrived at the restaurant. Kennedy nodded and got into the car with her and the umbrella. When they reached the restaurant, the waiter led them to the private room and opened the door for them. Samantha was already sitting there waiting for them. Maisie stepped forward. Auntie Samantha, sorry that we've kept you waiting for such a long time. Samantha stood up slowly and replied with a smile. The road is slippery on a rainy day, so it's better to be safe than sorry. Maisie waited for Samantha to sit down with Kennedy, then chose to sit beside Samantha. Uncle Kennedy, you're the one who's going to pay for the meal today. Shouldn't you ask Auntie Samantha what she wants to eat? Kennedy turned his head and looked at Samantha while the latter smiled. I'm not that picky when it comes to food. I'm fine with anything. Maisie handed the menu to Kennedy, who looked back at her. Z. Why don't you order for the three of us this time around? I'm not very familiar with what they have to offer here, and I don't know what's delicious and what's not. Maisie grabbed the menu into her hand. All right then. It would be my pleasure. She summoned the waiter and ordered some of the chef's signature platters. After confirming her orders, she then closed the menu and said, I would like a bottle of red wine too. Okay. Please give us a minute to get everything prepared. The waiter walked out with the menu. Samantha looked at her. Ms. Vanderbilt, I've always wanted to ask, how did you and Francisco get to know each other? Maisie smiled. We met in the training camp 3 years ago. Samantha nodded in a daze. Kennedy arranged the tableware and silverware that were laid on the table. She doesn't only know the second young heir of the Bouchers, but the eldest young heir of the Bouchers, too. It's thanks to my son and daughter. Both of them got a chance to film with Helios, and Helios took great care of them back then. Samantha was slightly surprised. You're married already? Maisie nodded. Kennedy added with a grin. Not only is she married, but she's also the mother of 3. Samantha smiled. Wow, Ms. Vanderbilt, I really didn't expect someone like you to be married and have 3 children at such a young age. That's great. Maisie propped her cheeks against both her palms. Even I would never have imagined that I would get married so early on in my life, but at least Nolan's worth it. After chatting for a while, the waiter started serving them the dishes. Maisie poured 2 glasses of red wine and looked at Kennedy. Uncle Kennedy. You should order a glass of fruit juice. You're still recovering from your injury, so you shouldn't be drinking. Kennedy was helpless. What else can I say when you've already spoken? Samantha looked at them and commented. You two do look a lot like father and daughter. Maisie responded to her comment, Uncle Kennedy is indeed a fatherly figure to me. As soon as she said that, a commotion came from outside the room before Kennedy could say anything. I'm sorry, sir. But we're serving our customers in this private room. You can't just step aside. Someone pushed the door open and came in. The first few men to enter the room were 3 to 4 bodyguards, and then the man who stepped into the private room last straightened his suit's jacket. Maisie recognized that the man was Eugene and frowned. Samantha's expression dimmed the moment she saw Eugene. What are you doing here? Eugene snorted. Why can't I come here? Do you really think I'll let you off just because you've divorced me? Samantha stood up. Eugene Boucher. This is not a place for you to mess around. Now get out of here. Chapter 730. Eugene glanced at Kennedy, who was sitting beside Samantha, and mocked, Oh, do you think that another man would take you in after your divorce? Kennedy's expression changed when he heard Eugene's extremely rude comment. Mr. Boucher, even though Ms. Green is your ex-wife, insulting her is really not something a man should do. Is this the upbringing of the Bouchers? The insinuating sarcasm infuriated Eugene. Just who do you think you are? How dare you judge me when I'm around? Samantha was well aware of Eugene's temper and was worried that he would really make a move on Kennedy. Eugene Boucher, if what you aim to do here is to create a stir, then get out of here and do it elsewhere. Oh. You're already starting to defend him? Eugene did not give in at all. He walked up to Kennedy and grabbed him by the hem of his collar. If you want to stand up for this woman, you'll have first to see just how capable you are. Kennedy stared directly at him with his unwavering gaze. So are you saying that you're going to get physical with me now, Mr. Boucher? Samantha's cheeks paled as she became a little anxious. Eugene had joined the army before this. He had trained with the force for several years, and that had contributed to his burly stature. She had seen him beat up a bodyguard and give him a few broken bones, and it was still a dreadful sight to her to this day. Mr. Fannin hasn't fully recovered yet. It'll be impossible for him to withstand Eugene's assault if they get into a fight. Samantha stepped forward and pulled Eugene away. Let go. What do you want? Eugene flung his arm and pushed her away. Samantha lost her balance and fell back onto the chair. Maisie got up from her chair and supported her, but the 4 bodyguards surrounded them. Maisie kept calm throughout the whole process. She knew that she could not act rashly when Sadie was not present. Kennedy grabbed Eugene's collar with his hand. Can you still call yourself a man when you do something like that to a woman? Eugene scoffed. Forcibly removed Kennedy's hand from his collar, and flattened the folds found on the collar. What I do to my ex-wife is none of your business. The only person that you should worry about at this moment is yourself. Eugene ordered his bodyguards to make a move on Kennedy. And the bodyguards stepped forward and grabbed him. Samantha rushed up, pushed them away, stopped in front of Kennedy, and glared at Eugene. Have you lost your mind? You're disrespecting an innocent man's life. Samantha's actions enraged Eugene, so he stepped forward, stretched out his hand, and grabbed her hair, forcing her to face him. Bitch, you can't wait to find yourself another man as soon as you got the divorce that you asked for? Why didn't I know that you're such a lustful slut? The humiliating words sliced through Samantha's heart. However, she had already gotten numb to his emotional abuse. All she could do was look back at her young self and laugh at how she would fall for such a man and marry him in the first place. Your thoughts are still as filthy as ever. But allow me to remind you that what happens between other men and me is none of your business ever since the day we got officially divorced. Eugene lifted his arm, and Samantha closed her eyes. Anyway, this is not the first time already. Father! Francisco yelled as he and Helios appeared outside the door. Maisie was stunned when she saw Helios. I did send a text to Francisco informing him about this meal. But I didn't expect Helios to be here either. Eugene let go of Samantha and frowned. Why are you here? Francisco walked up to him and stopped in front of him. Were you really going to hit Mom if we hadn't come in time? Eugene glanced at his son and then shifted his gaze onto Helios. Helios, this isn't something that you should intervene in. I won't. It's just that, have you forgotten that promise that you made in front of Grandfather? Eugene's expression changed. He was obviously thinking about what his father had said to him back then. Francisco walked up to his mother and said to him, Didn't I tell you that since you and Mother are now divorced, you shouldn't come to her and make her life difficult?